One of the most interesting distilleries from the history of the Black Forest of southern Indiana was that once known as Old Clifty. Located in what is now commonly known as Cave River Valley, Clifty boasts a long and complicated history that, like most other distilleries of the region, has not been very well documented. As a distiller, I would maintain that I cannot imagine any place in Indiana, let alone on God's earth, that would be better host to the production of fine spirits, made in the way of the old traditions, than that which is available in this verdant valley. In no way does the valley seem to be a place that could possibly exist in southern Indiana, and yet there it sits. The valley itself is steep-walled and fairly narrow, well situated with its own water source, Clifty Creek, once declared navigable by the Indiana state government, and from which that creek draws its source. The head of the valley is home to two large caves, Wet Clifty, also known as River Cave, and Dry Clifty, also known as Endless Cave. Matthew Coffin originally entered the land in this area, but quickly sold his share off to a New York-based entrepreneur and mill owner by the name of John Hammersley. Hammersley was a millwright by trade and had sent his apprentice Hugh Hamer, later of Spring Mill fame, down to the southern Indiana hills to find him a fine place to build a mill and subsequently a distillery. Hammersley and his two brothers were notified of the paradise and immediately set out for the then territory and arrived in haste. Unfortunately, one of John's daughters was lost in the move. Either run off or possibly abducted by Native Americans, the history is not clear. The mill was built in 1818 and a distillery was added shortly thereafter. It seems that John's skills as a millwright were in deep demand, as thereafter he set to work building a number of unique mills in the area, including one which was comprised of two flatboats running an undershot wheel between them, with the gristing taking place in the stream itself. This one lasted until a spring flood washed it downstream, where it broke apart near New Palestine. John held another mill on Sugar Creek for a number of years in the mid-1820s near Bono, a then thriving and now non-existent town in that section of Washington County. Hammersley's two brothers, Ike and George, as well as Hugh Hamer and his brother Thomas, set to work turning the Old Clifty into a productive mill and distillery, while work for John continued to flow in, including the retrofitting of Montgomery Mill, now Spring Mill, which Hammersley took under his wing. At this time, the primary product of Old Clifty was corn whiskey, probably utilizing some proportion of other small grains as were available, although apple and peach brandy would have been made as the fruit was available seasonally. For Hugh Hamer, this work and the knowledge gleaned from it would prove indispensable, as years later he and his brothers would purchase Spring Mill, and his name would be well known for the Old Hamer whiskey produced from his own establishment and distilled by the expert hand of Mr. William Dalton, who worked that distillery for 55 years. As an interesting side note, it's around this time in history that another New Yorker by the name of Joel Calkins made his way to the same district. Having heard that the distillery businesses were booming in the region, and acting off of information gleaned from early American distilling literature and the word of distillers back east, which detailed hops having been used by some distillers as an antibacterial in their yeast starter and whiskey mash, Calkins sold or traded his property back in New York for a supply of hops that he had hoped to sell at a large profit upon arrival near Campbellsburg, Indiana. He was sadly disappointed that the hops were not in demand by Hoosier distillers and lost his bet substantially. The local school district then became known as the Hop School District and was later combined with the Thompson School District. The cemetery not a mile south of the valley and where my wife's grandparents and great-grandparents were laid to rest still bears the title Hop Thompson. Hammersley eventually sold the Clifty property to his son James and headed to Avon, Indiana, where he set up yet another operation in the same business. The property passed hands multiple times until it came into possession of Henry Robertson. Robertson made multiple upgrades to both the mill and the distillery, including the conversion of power for both from the water wheel to that of a turbine system, and the building of a large and beautiful home, as well as the installation of a large pipe for the delivery of water as opposed to the old wooden flume. Robertson found both the milling and distilling to be highly profitable ventures for himself and held the property until his death in 1891. Under Robertson's watchful eye, brandy became much more the focus of his distilling efforts, and apple orchards were planted on nearby Clover Hill to feed the distillery as well. Apples and grains were bought from local residents. At this time, assessing the mill and the still house was, and still remains, difficult at best, as the steep valley walls didn't provide a good road, and what roads were built into the valley were constantly damaged by heavy rains. To accommodate the arrival of corn and apples to the valley, a wooden flume was built on the south side of the mill by which delivery of the produce was effected. Wagons could pull up on the overlooking ridge, drop their corn or apples down in the flume, by which they would roll down the steep slope and find themselves in Robertson's bins for processing. The book Blue Echo Memories comments on a child falling down this flume during a celebration of the valley. Though he lived, he was apparently pretty skinned up for his effort, something I'm sure he never forgot. Peach brandy was a very much sought-after commodity in the far-off markets as well as the local taverns, and nearly every southern Indiana distiller produced peach brandy in the greatest possible abundance that he could at the time, hindered only by years with bad crops or the otherwise unavailability of that type of fruit. As we have detailed here, the Fleener peach had long ago been introduced into the Hoosier frontier and become a stalwart varietal all over southern Indiana, known for being incredibly adaptable, productive, easy to grow, and for making the best peach brandy known in the southern hills. At one point in time, this peach was being offered by nurseries as far away as Michigan, and much stock was shipped to orchardists and home gardeners via the railroads. Robertson had apparently had much trouble sourcing peaches for many years and had decided to take it upon himself to rectify said situation by purchasing and planting several thousand Fleener peach trees on the hills south of the mill. Through disease, misfortune, or outright bad luck, not a single of these trees produced for Robertson, a situation unheard of anywhere else in the county regarding that most reliable of fruit producers. Another story comes down to us from the account of Mr. Donald Fouch, an orchardist near Campbellsburg who grew many acres of apples. At this time, the temperance movement was gaining much steam and would eventually drive the last of the coffin nails in the Hoosier distilling industry. Even at that time, in the late 1800s, there were many people of devout faith who swore the devil himself lived in the local whiskey machines and refused to do business with those who might corrupt God's crop to further corrupt man's soul. Apparently, Mr. Fouch was not having any luck moving his apple crop that season, and as such, the apples fell to the ground to rot. He was preparing to leave for a few days and left his son with explicit instructions that under no circumstances should these apples be sold and delivered to Mr. Robertson to feed his still. After the father left, the son set to picking up the apples and placing them in the trailer for delivery, yet to that scoundrel stiller. Just as he was finishing up his sinful chore, his father arrived back at the orchard, whereupon he made the boy dump the apples back on the ground to rot. During the Robertson years, the local 4th of July celebration was held on the property. Although it was a temperate event, and Robertson and the other distillers in the valley would not sell liquor to patrons during the event, the moment the festivities ended, the still house was open to revelers to carry out with them however many gallons they pleased. After Robertson's death in 1891, it took a number of years to settle his estate, but by 1897, Mr. William Ryman, with his miller on hand, John Hopper, re-entered the business native to the valley. They ran the mill and distillery for another 4 years until Ryman passed, and Hopper took over for 1 more year. After this, the mill and distillery were abandoned, although rumors persist of moonshiners using the valley for their operations for many years prior to being busted by revenue agents, and the old mill itself became a roadhouse in the late 1920s. As an aside, there seems to have been a rivalry between Robertson and another local distilling family, the Brewers, as to who in fact made the best whiskey and brandy. In fact, the valley itself was home to as many as 5 commercial distilleries, many of whom have relatives still extant in the local area, including the Brewers, the Wesners, and the Schroyers. Adam Brewer, better known as Ad Brewer, made news in the area newspapers in October 1915 with the announcement that he was going to try an entirely new departure in the distilling line by attempting to make some pawpaw brandy. The reason for this was that the quantity of apples with which to make the noted Indiana Applejack brandy was very small that year, only enough perhaps to make 10 barrels. While it was a banner year for pawpaws, Brewer expected the new product to be as good for medicinal purposes as apple brandy. The new product was not a smashing success. Dr. L.W. Painter, then practicing in Campbellsburg, described it as, quote-unquote, the most potent liquor ever made here, equaled and kicked no doubt by nothing less powerful than aguardiente or tequila of Mexican make, was the pawpaw brandy which was distilled here before the World War. It has long been my contention that any single nation engaged in that war, had it been equipped with a few thousand gallons of that pawpaw brandy, could have changed history and made over the map of Europe to its own liking. Such was the potency of this distillate. But the memories aroused through mention of this brandy and the ludicrous incidents attendant upon the treatment of some of my patients who had imbibed too freely of it, has caused me to wander far afield from my subject. Charles E. Cook, who worked for Dr. Painter's farm at the time for 50 cents a day, later reported that one day he took some of Doc's apples out to Clifty. As was the custom of the times, he received his payment partly in cash and partly in brandy. This time the brandy happened to be of the new pawpaw variety. According to Cook, Brewer had gotten the proof high enough but could not get the poison out. As a result, Cook's eyes, face, and tongue became badly swollen, the same results being experienced by several others who drank the brandy, according to Cook. Sadly, Adam Brewer was one of the few pre-Prohibition Hoosier distillers who had grand plans to return from Prohibition by restarting the Old Clifty Distillery and Mill. In 1931, he was delivering a wagon load of corn down a large hill into the valley to mill for whiskey production when the wagon overturned and killed him. He's buried at the Hop Thompson Cemetery about a mile south of the old distillery. It's also to be said and noted that Mr. Brewer predicted his own death. It's just the night before he had told his wife, in a cold sweat, that he had dreamed that he would die the next day in a terrible accident. This ends the history of the Cave River Valley Distilling Complex. Although it is in no way complete, we will revisit it soon. So we're down at Cave River Valley, Old Clifty, today on a little family adventure, but also recording another little, what I call a Pocku-Mentary, and getting ready to set some yeast traps. So those of you who are familiar with the park, there used to be a cabin here when it was a park, but before that, this was actually the foundation of the Old Clifty Mill. That's actually the corner of the mill right there. Come around to the side, you might be able to see where there used to be a little window there that you can actually identify by the picture of Old Clifty that's on the front of our Old Clifty Hoosier Apple Brandy at Spirits of French Lick. The distillery actually sits down here where I'm standing. This is actually, well, let's see, yeah, this is one of the foundation stones of the old distillery. There's another foundation stone for the old distillery. And conveniently right here is a lone apple tree. And fruit trees tend to be great places to capture yeast. So we're going to set a couple of yeast traps using 2 parts flour, 1 part water, and see if we can't capture some viable yeast from the Old Clifty Mill and Distillery today. Luckily for us, this old apple tree has got a little spot on the side of it, probably where it was grafted, where it's rotted a bit, makes a nice little shelf. We're going to set that jar there and leave it for the duration of the day, pick it up later. The other thing we're going to do is, the apple tree is currently blooming, so I'm going to take the second jar and I'm actually going to gather some of these flowers and drop in the jar and presume that those flowers are harvesting some yeast, or are harboring some yeast that we can put to use.